Welcome back to Steel City Sports. So today we're going to be taking a look at the first round losers of the NBA playoffs. And I'm going to be talking about my expectations for them in the near future. What do I expect from them going forward? What's next ultimately for these teams? We had some things that I expected happen in the first round. We had some really weird upsets happen. We're going to get into all of it right now. And I encourage you to comment down below your thoughts on all these matchups and what do you think is best for these teams going forward. So we're going to start off with the New Orleans Pelicans. Not really a big surprise that they lost to the OKC Thunder, but obviously the big story for the Pelicans, and they're not the only team that obviously dealt with this, but their best player was injured in Zion Williamson. And this is one of the teams in the NBA that I just cannot imagine being a fan of this team because it has to be unbelievably frustrating because you know when fully healthy that this is a top-tier team, especially in the Western Conference. We've seen stretches of basketball in the regular season where the Pelicans are competing with the elite teams, where this team has the talent at full strength to be a team to make a deep run in the playoffs. But it's the same story year in and year out. They can just never get fully healthy. Zion always is hurt. And it just sucks. It really does. I really feel bad for the Pelicans fans because I think if they had a fully healthy team, they could really compete. I think that they have perfectly built this roster, perfectly constructed the roster to be around Zion Williamson. They got shooters all over the team. They got defenders. They got skill guys. It's one of the deeper teams in the NBA. I really like their head coach of Willie Green. So there's a lot going in the right direction, but ultimately, if your number one guy, if your superstar in Zion is not playing, you don't really stand much of a chance. And like I said, we've seen that play out for the Pelicans year in and year out now. So what's the outlook for them going forward? Well, obviously, you can't trade Zion Williamson for a multitude of reasons, but number one would be, obviously, you're not going to recoup the value of Zion. I don't know what Zion on the open market would get you. So it's for me, it would not be worth it to move on from Zion. Even though he's plagued by injuries, you just can't move off him, especially because he is still young. I feel like that would be a massive mistake to move off of him just because we've seen the high upside when he plays. I look back to that play-in game against the Lakers where it looked like they were out of that game. They were down double digits, but then Zion just physically took over on both sides of the floor of that game and was incredible, had 40 points. Then he gets hurt, and then the Pelicans are not able to close it out without him. And that's just the story of the New Orleans Pelicans. But like I said, you can't move off him, at least now. I think the most likely big quote-unquote move for the Pelicans this offseason would be to trade Brandon Ingram. And I'm now starting to see that heat up now. And for me, I know CJ McCollum had a really good regular season this year, especially from behind the arc. But in that play-in game and the playoff series against the Thunder, he was really bad. And I just never loved the fit of CJ McCollum as a point guard. For me, he is really a two guard. And I just don't think you are going to make a deep run with CJ McCollum as one of your guards. I just don't really think he plays winning basketball. And I'm not trying to sound like a hater of CJ McCollum. I just think that those type of players are extremely difficult to build winning teams around, because if he's not scoring the ball, what the fuck is he doing? So, we've seen this multiple times now with CJ where he just disappears in the playoffs. So for me, I would prioritize getting a legit playmaker at the point guard position. And I think there will be a couple guys on the market. A big name for me to watch for the Pelicans would be DeJounte Murray, because the Atlanta Hawks, they could, especially now that they have the number one overall pick, they're a team to watch to just blow it up. They could potentially move off all their guys, draft Alex Sarr, number one overall, and just completely rebuild their team that way. So if they're having a fire sale, I would maybe call up for a CJ and pick swap for DeJounte. Maybe if you want to do Brandon Ingram for DeJounte straight up. I don't know if that financially works. And they just have a plethora of young athletic wings. And for me, Brandon Ingram just feels like the odd man out. It sucks because he is really good. I feel like whenever Zion plays, they do complement each other very well. But like I said, he just feels like the odd man out for me. And if you can really land a legit point guard like DeJounte. Another point guard that I thought could maybe be realistic. I don't think it's the case now. It really would have had. It would have had the Cavs would have had to have lost in the first round, I think, for this to happen. But I did have an idea of maybe a Brandon Ingram for Darius Garland swap was another one I was thinking of, because if you go back to Donovan Mitchell's first year in Cleveland, Darius Garland was out for like the first chunk of that season. Donovan Mitchell played the point guard for that stretch, and he was fantastic. He was actually like getting MVP buzz. He was incredible as the point guard. So my theory on that was like, if you trade Darius Garland away, you can move Donovan to the full-time point guard and give him just another really good high-end player in Brandon Ingram to play with alongside the other guys they have there. So I think that trade could honestly be a win-win, even though I think Darius Garland is obviously younger and has probably higher upside than Brandon Ingram. But we're getting off into deep theoretical stuff here. Like I said, I want you to comment down below. What do you think the path is for the Pelicans? The most likely option, personally, I see them doing is just standing pat and running this team back. And I think they kind of have the built-in excuse of, look, we have the team when healthy. Let's just give it another year, cross our fingers that Zion is healthy for this year. How likely that is to happen, I don't know. I still think it's probably naive at this point to really rely on that. But if you're the Pelicans, what other choice do you have? Like I said, you're not trading Zion away. So the most likely thing I think for the Pelicans as an organization moving forward is they're just going to stand pat and run it back next year with the potential of maybe moving off Brandon Ingram, but I do think it is kind of unlikely. So the next team I want to talk about is the LA Clippers, who lost to the Dallas Mavericks. So I think that they've really backed themselves up into a corner in terms of the current construction of this roster, in terms of the draft capital that they gave up to construct the roster. They don't really have a choice. With the Pelicans, they do have some options in terms of trading. What are like the realistic options the Clippers can do to shake this roster up? And that they fell into a similar camp of the Pelicans. They're one of those teams that dealt with injuries. I know. Now that's what a shocker. The Clippers are dealing with injuries come playoff time. They're another team I could not imagine being a fan of in terms of the frustration, because we've seen again, and I think even to a higher degree than the Pelicans, when fully healthy, they could be a championship level team. There was about a month and a half stretch of the regular season where the Clippers looked unbeatable. They looked like the best team in basketball for a month and a half stretch there. But obviously, playoffs roll around. Kawhi Leonard has the knee inflammation. I think they clearly rushed him back. He wasn't ready, and led to them losing to the Dallas Mavericks. So going forward, then, in terms of what's next, like I said, there's really not much of an option with the current Clippers team, especially when you throw in the fact that they're going to be opening up their new arena next year. So, they have a higher... They have a higher incentive than other teams to really double down in terms of their owner. I get it; he's filthy fucking rich, but he wants to make money on this arena he just built. And in terms of getting people to the arena, you got to have the stars to draw people. So I don't see them doing a big blow up rebuild. It's not very realistic. Even though I think at this point in time, I would bet basically everything I own that this current construction of this Clippers team will never reach the finals, because we've seen year in and year out for 4 years now, this team is just not physically able to stay healthy. Whether it's Paul George, whether it's Kawhi, James Harden was healthy with the Clippers, but he's dealt with injury stuff in the past, especially obviously in Brooklyn with the hamstring. So I think in terms of going forward, they're just going to double down on this team. They're going to bring everybody back. The Paul George thing is interesting, because if I don't know why they would get so hung up on not wanting to give Paul George a max, because what's the alternative to that? Let's say Philly or Orlando or whatever, just throw one of those teams out there that's got cap space, say they sign Paul George away because you were bickering over a couple mil here and there with Paul George. What's the outlook then? You got 35-year-old James Harden and Kawhi Leonard, who can't stay on the floor, that is a very scary outlook, and if I were running the Clippers, I would be terrified to do that, because losing Paul George on this team automatically lowers the ceiling of this team. Even when you have Paul George, I don't think their ceiling is a championship team, just given their injury situation, but you got a puncher's shot with Paul George, and I think you can even argue that Paul George has been the best player on the Clippers for years now, because I know he's another guy that deals with a lot of injuries, but he plays a hell of a lot more games than Kawhi Leonard, and I always point back to the 2021 playoffs. He had his best run in the playoffs, leading them to the conference final, leading them to beat that one-seeded Jazz team in the second round. So I don't get that. I don't get the bickering with Paul George over not wanting to give him a max, because the alternative of letting him walk, then you just have Harden and Kawhi, automatically lowers your ceiling. So again, similar to what I said about the Pelicans, just such a frustrating team. I cannot imagine rooting for this team. 2020 was the last time we saw their two stars fully healthy come playoff time, and they completely shit their pants in the bubble. 2021, Kawhi gets hurt. 2022, they were both hurt. 2023, last year, Paul George gets hurt right before playoffs, and then Kawhi gets hurt in Game 1 against the Suns. Then this year, Kawhi Leonard's got the knee inflammation. It's like they are a cursed franchise. I don't know what the hell they did, but it seems like they're never going to be able to get it right. And it sucks, because when they were first formed, I thought they were going to be at least win one ring. I thought that they were going to be, an incredible team. And now looking back on it, they're just going to be one of the biggest what-ifs of this era. Next up, we have the Phoenix Suns, who got swept by the Timberwolves. And this is really the team that made me do this video. This is the team that I wanted to talk about the most in terms of the first-round losers. Because if you would have said before the season started that this Phoenix Suns team is going to be 100% healthy going into playoffs, and they lose in the first round, that is such an utter disappointment. That is a complete and unmitigated disaster. But on top of that, they got swept in the first round by the Timberwolves. That is a fucking disgrace. This Suns team is pathetic. It really is. And I talked about this right after the sweep happened. I talked about how the construction of the Suns team is ultimately flawed, and there are so many different issues with the Phoenix Suns team, but it really ultimately comes down to the fact that they are the way that they've constructed their team with this Big Three model is something of a bygone era. The Big Three era is long gone. It's dead. It's no longer a winning recipe in today's NBA. You look at the past, however many champions, they're all constructed teams through the draft. They're not really just big names thrown together. You look at the Nuggets. You look at the 2022 Warriors. You look at the Bucks. These are all teams that were over time kind of put together by teams, not just thrown together off of star names. And that's a big issue I had with the Phoenix Suns. Another big problem I had was I never loved Devin Booker as the point guard. I think that was always going to be a thing that came up to bite them in the ass, is because that's not the role Devin Booker's supposed to be playing on the court, and I get it. I've given him credit for this. He's definitely grown as a playmaker. I'm not trying to deny that, but in terms of playing a full season as the point guard position, you are limiting the potential of what Devin Booker can be, because he is supposed to be purely a bucket getter. I don't want him focusing on playmaking. That's not his role on the court. I don't like that. And ultimately, if one of your big three has an off night, you're fucked, because who else on this team can step up offensively and make up for that production? This is one of the thinnest rosters in the NBA. I like Grayson Allen a lot, but outside of him, what is this team in terms of the depth around the quote unquote big three? So if one of their big three guys has an off night, they're screwed. They need all three of them to have perfect games in order for them to win a playoff series. And relying on a guy like Bradley Beal, especially at this point in time, I think you can argue Bradley Beal's on the worst contract in the NBA, because not only is he making max money, but he also has a no trade clause. So no matter what, he's stuck there for 3 years. So in terms of what's next for this team, they might have the bleakest future out of all the teams we're going to talk about in this video, because Like Bradley Beal, no matter what you do, Bradley Beal's on this team for the next 3 years. You can't change that no matter what. So he's there. KD, we've seen KD run from this situation time after time. He did it with the Thunder. The Warriors, kind of a weird situation how he left Brooklyn. In Brooklyn, they catered to Kevin Durant in every which way. And this is, I think Kevin Durant leaving the Nets is even a weaker move than him leaving the Thunder, because in Brooklyn, it was his team. It was his franchise. They were catering to everything Kevin Durant wanted. They hired the coach he wanted in Steve Nash. Then he throws a temper tantrum once Steve Nash fired. They did that for him. They brought in a new head coach. They traded for James Harden for him. Every person who was brought into Brooklyn had to be okayed by Kevin Durant. They did everything for the guy, and he still gave him a giant middle finger and said, "Fuck you, I want to be traded." And now I think that that's going to happen again in Phoenix, because I could quickly see this team just imploding, because if Devin Booker and Kevin Durant basically don't combine for 90 points on a night-in, night-out basis, this team is fucked, because who's going to step up? Bradley Beal is washed. I'm officially pounding the gavel on Bradley Beal. He is washed. He was a fucking disgrace in that playoff series against the Timberwolves, an absolute no-show. Devin Booker, wildly inconsistent. Kevin Durant was really the only guy who consistently showed up. I know he had one bad game, but overall in that series was really the only player on the Phoenix Suns that showed up for that series. Everyone else, wildly inconsistent. Devin Booker, I give him a lot of credit for Game 4, where he had 49 on really good shooting efficiency, kind of disappeared towards the end of the fourth, obviously, but I don't know with this Suns team, because you can make like marginal changes, obviously with like some role players here and there. But ultimately, this is the team. This is the big three. That is the team. Unless you're breaking up the big three, then there's really no big change you can make. And it's sad to see, because that Suns team with Chris Paul, Devin Booker, DeAndre Ayton, Mikal Bridges, that was one of the more fun teams that I've seen since I've started watching basketball. I've been watching basketball for about 8 years now, and that Suns team is one of the ones that I'm going to look back more fondly of. They were just a fun team. They were really, they played the right way. Chris Paul, you could argue, had like the best stretch of his career there in that 2021 season where they got to the finals, and how quickly it just kind of imploded. It is such a shame. So the Phoenix Suns going forward, I think they don't have a choice. That similar to the Clippers, they've kind of backed themselves into a corner, and they have really no other choice but to run it back next year. And is the result ultimately going to be that different? No, because the structure of this team is going to be the same next year. And even the outside chance that they could win a playoff series, which even that, I think that's kind of far-fetched. Even if they would win a playoff series, you really think they're going to win a 2 playoff series? Absolutely not. Like, they cannot hang with the elite teams in the Western Conference. So, like I said, they could have the bleakest future of all these teams going forward. I would not be surprised if Kevin Durant asked out. There's a very likely scenario that plays out. Let's say going into next year, obviously Bradley Beal, not the same player he was in Washington. Let's say like Devin Booker gets hurt or KD gets hurt. They start off the year like something like, I don't know, like 8-15, just get a bad start. Like, you're telling me Kevin Durant wouldn't ask for a trade? He wouldn't request a trade? We saw him do it in Brooklyn. Like, I don't know. And they've even fired Frank Vogel now. And now they brought in Bud. I like Coach Bud, but is Coach Bud that big of a basketball genius to repair the structural flaws of this organization? I don't think so. So the Suns, I think they're going to run it back next year. I think they're basically a powder keg. They could pretty quickly self-implode and KD asks out. And that's kind of that for the Suns. So I'm sorry to be so negative about this, but I think it's just the realistic path for the Phoenix Suns. Our last first-round loser in the Western Conference was the Los Angeles Lakers, who did avoid a sweep. Unlike last year, they did actually get a game off the Nuggets, but they ultimately do lose in 5. So what's next for the Lakers? I just see them running it back. I have a hard time thinking the Lakers are going to make any sort of drastic move. I've heard that, rumblings that LeBron can maybe go to a new team. I think it's basically, 0.0001% chance of LeBron leaving the Lakers. I would be genuinely shocked if he was not a Laker next year. I think, very quickly we can spend some time on maybe hypothetical destinations for LeBron. If he were to leave, again, I don't think it's that realistic, but if he were to leave, what would be some realistic landing spots? I think it would come down to 3. And the one is kind of just a wild card. It's wherever Bronny gets drafted. Let's just say he wants to go there. Some random team just drafts Bronny. He can be, he can opt out and be a free agent and just go to that team. That could happen. Or if you want to look at 2 other actual landing spots outside of Bronny where he could go, one would make sense is Cleveland. If he wanted to go back to Cleveland, just in terms of the ending out his career, if he wanted to do a farewell tour with the Cavs, I think that would make a ton of sense. And they actually have a real team, with Donovan, Garland, Mobley, Allen. You just that starting 5, just put LeBron at that 3. Wow, that is an incredible team. And it could really, I think, easily threaten for the Eastern Conference. That would be a great team. The really one that's way out in wacky la-la land is the Warriors, because he's made it known that he wants to play with Steph. Don't see that happening, but again, maybe a 0.00000001% chance he's a Warrior next year. And then, like we said, maybe he'll end up playing with Bronny if the Lakers don't draft him. But I ultimately do think the most likely scenario for the Lakers this offseason is I do see them drafting Bronny, whether that's in the late first round or whenever their pick is, or in the second round, or even if he goes undrafted, they can obviously just sign him as an undrafted free agent. But I would actually feel comfortable betting money on the fact that Bronny will be a Laker next year, and I think that next year could even be LeBron's farewell tour. Maybe before next year, if they get Bronny, he could announce that that's his final year with the Lakers. They're going to play it out. They can still be kind of a competitive team. They can still make the playoffs. But in terms of making any drastic shake-up moves to the roster, it's not really realistic because you're not getting rid of Anthony Davis. If you're running the Lakers, you don't want LeBron to go. And in terms of the role players, again, what really drastically can you change? I think D'Lo's coming back. He had a good stretch, even though he was terrible against the Nuggets. He did have he was good in the regular season. He was good in the play-in game against the Pelicans. You got Reeves, you got Hachimura, you got V8 who was hurt this past year. There are definitely pieces to this team. Just a year ago, they got to the conference final. So I think if the Lakers, their most realistic thing is they're just going to run it back. I don't really see a drastic change to the Lakers next year outside of drafting Bronny. So that's kind of been my ramble here about, the Western Conference first round losers. So this is part 1 of this series. I will be making a part 2 where we're obviously going to cover the Eastern Conference first round losers. So definitely let me know down in the comments your thoughts on all this, and what do you see, realistic paths for these teams going forward. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.